Welcome back, U.S. History. We're going to do Chapter 2, Sections 2 and 3 today. Before we get started with these two sections, I just want to remind you of the learning goal. For Section 2, we will be focusing on identifying important events that took place during the war. And then for Section 3, we're going to trace the development of the American Republic. So to review some of the slides from the last presentation, Lexington and Concord is an important event during the war because it's basically the first fighting that takes place between the British and the American colonists. It's the first battle of the American Revolution. It takes place in April of 1775. Has a huge impact on the development of the United States. Another important battle from the last presentation is the Battle of Bunker Hill. It's notable because it is the deadliest battle of the war. The colonists initially had the advantage of being on the upper portion of the hill where they could fire down on the redcoats as they were charging the hill. The colonists ran out of ammunition and were forced to retreat. So going into Section 2, the American colonists were divided into two parties, or into two groups. You have those that are loyal to the British government and to the King George, which would be considered the Loyalists, and then you have those that are fighting for independence, who would be considered the Patriots. There were early battles in New York City in which the British Empire was successful and they were able to capture New York, and colonial troops are able to surprise the British at the Battle of Saratoga, which is considered the turning point battle of the War for Independence because it shows the rest of the world that it looks like the colonists can actually defeat, or they have a chance against, the British Empire. So the Battle of Saratoga inspires the French to support the American colonists and their war for independence. A French military leader, Marquis de Lafayette, he chooses to help the American colonists, and through his help, the colonists become, or the Continental Army becomes, more effective fighters. In May of 1780, British troops successfully take Charlestown, South Carolina. However, that is the last battle or major victory for the British, and General Cornwallis and the British soldiers finally surrender to the Continental Army at Yorktown, Virginia on October 18, 1781. The Americans' victory shocks the world. Treaty of Paris is the official document that ends the war and recognizes the United States as an independent country. It sets the boundaries for the United States, and it is signed on September of 1783. The American negotiating team included of John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. We're going to move on to Section 3, which our learning goal for this section is to trace the development of the American Republic. In this section, we're going to look at how the American Republic began and the transformations that it went through to reach the Constitution. After the Revolution, many of the colonists, now Americans, favored the idea of a republic. Some supported a strong federal government, and those supporters were known as Federalists, and there were others that supported strong states' rights or state governments, which would be considered Anti-Federalists. The Articles of Confederation was a set of laws that was established in 1781 by the Second Continental Congress. It gave each state one vote in Congress regardless of the state's population, and it split the power between the national government and the state governments. Basically, it was a loose agreement between the states. Some of the accomplishments or the noteworthy items from the Articles of Confederation. One, it was America's first constitution. It was able to establish national governments with the responsibilities or the abilities to wage war, sign treaties, coin money, and run post offices. And then the land ordinances of 1785 and the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787 helped for acquiring new territories, selling off of land, and for establishing the requirements for applying for statehood. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation included that Congress was not able to collect taxes, so the colonists were fearful of giving power to the government to collect taxes because of the experiences that they had with Great Britain. And so that was one power that they did not grant to the federal government. Each state had one vote regardless of their population. There was no executive branch, which means there was no president. There was no national court system. 9 of the 13 states needed to agree to pass any law, and it lacked national unity and had a weak central government. One of the events that really highlight the weakness of the Articles of Confederation is Shay's Rebellion, and it proves how weak the central government is when you have these protesters over taxes in Massachusetts, and this protest and the attempt to seize a federal arsenal is causes alarm throughout the rest of the states. So the delegates at the Constitutional Convention realized the need to either alter or amend and grant more rights to the central government. They soon decided to create an entirely new constitution instead of amending the Articles. So they scrapped the Articles of Confederation, and the delegates at the Constitutional Convention decided to rewrite or start from scratch a constitution with the idea of compromise to try and satisfy the needs of all the states. So compromise comes into play initially with the Virginia and the New Jersey plans. The Virginia plan called for a bicameral legislation, and bicameral legislation means two-house lawmaking body, and they wanted this lawmaking body based on the state population. So however large your state is depends on how many representatives you send. Then on the other hand, you have the New Jersey plan, which calls for a unicameral legislation or a one-house lawmaking body based on equal representation. So one state equals one vote. After a deadlock on the Virginia and the New Jersey plan, Roger Sherman finally suggested a compromise, which becomes known as the Great Compromise, and it satisfies both the large and the small states. So it does that by issuing a bicameral Congress, and that means the two houses, based on the House of Representatives being based on population, so that satisfies the Virginia plan. And then you have the Senate, which is based on equal representation, so one state equals one vote, which satisfies the small states that were supporting the New Jersey plan. The next compromise that the Constitutional Convention delegates had to reach was based on how the population was counted. A lot of the southern states had a majority population of African slaves, and because they were considered property, they felt like the northern states felt like they shouldn't be counted as part of the population, especially since the northern states didn't have a lot of slaves. And the southern states obviously wanted the slaves counted in the population because that would give them more representation in the House of Representatives. So in order to compromise on this issue, they came up with the 3/5 compromise, which counts the slaves as 3/5 of a person. The next issue was whether or not the national government or the states should hold power or more power. The delegates choose to split the power between the national government and the state governments. The federalism system was developed. The federal government had delegated or enumerated powers like coining money, trade, declaring war, and the states had reserve powers like the educational systems. This is a way to ensure that none of the branches of government are more powerful than the other. So the checks and balances system. Our Constitution calls for 3 branches of government. So here we have the legislation or the legislative branch, which is made up of the 2 houses, the House of Representatives based on the state's population, and the Senate based on the 1 vote. Then we have the executive branch, who has the president and the vice president, and the judicial branch, which has the Supreme Court. The Constitutional Convention adjourned in September of 1787. 9 of the 13 states had to ratify the Constitution. Supporters for the Constitution were called the Federalists, and those that were opposed to the Constitution were known as the Anti-Federalists. Some of the Federalists included Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And the Federalists believed that while the Constitution wasn't perfect, it was far better than the Articles of Confederation. And the Federalists supported the idea of a strong central government. On the other hand, you have the Anti-Federalists, and they viewed that the Constitution did not guarantee the rights of the people of the states. And this was a big issue for the Anti-Federalists, and they were led by Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Richard Henry Lee. And they wanted a Bill of Rights to set off the strong central government. To satisfy the states' rights advocates, a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to guarantee individual rights. And this Bill of Rights was ratified in December of 1791, 3 years after the Constitution itself was ratified, and the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Our Constitution is the oldest living Constitution. It's considered a living document because it can be added to or have things taken away from it in order to meet the needs of what's going on in the world at that particular time. 27 amendments have been added to the Constitution since its establishment.